Greetings all. It's my pleasure and honor to be with you today and to share with you my job as moderator for this timely event that will kick off the 20th anniversary of the HistoryMakers, the unique and all-important organization whose leader, Juliana Richardson, realized more than 20 years ago, and this organization for 20 years, she has been dedicated to addressing the lack of documentation and preservation of the African-American historical record, the achievements and struggles that have gone undocumented at the time of the organization's founding. To quote from its own narrative, the HistoryMakers was born out of our founder's dream to address this problem by capturing one person at a time the untold personal stories of both well-known and unsung African Americans, and by creating a priceless video collection, giving those involved their special place in history. So I'd like to begin with a brief look back with some powerful, challenging words from one of our civil rights icons, Ernie Green.
The Montgomery Bus Boycott was, at the end of the day, not just a protest movement. It was moving people and figuring out schedules and which corner, and you had all these carpools. And if we were to try to do it today, you know, we'd have to have computers and programmers, and we'd have cell phones, and we'd have Blackberries. I mean, they did all of that on the back of their hands, yeah? Whose car was going to have gas, how to pay for it. I mean, it was, and so we don't present this as some huge building of the pyramid. So our children see that this was an enormous accomplishment. I mean, it was more than just getting people to get off their duffs. It was a movement in logistics.
On some level, at some point in our lives, we've got to begin to get people to understand that all that I got from Malcolm and Martin, all that I got from the nation, all that I got from the many nationalist organizations that I belong to, you know, from BUF to you name it, all that I got, I'm putting it to use and saying, but I'm not just going to limit it to a few people. I'm going to take it out to this larger world and say, here we is. You know, I know I teach English. Here we is, you know. And I expect for you, larger world, to understand what I'm saying right now. And that's what I'm doing today. You know, that's where I'm going today. You know, I am insisting that people be human. I'm insisting that they walk upright like human beings. And I don't care if you're black, green, purple, blue, gay, lesbian, I don't care who you be. But the point is that if you're going to stay on this earth is going to demand that you be that you be human, and you walk upright like a human being.
There are a group of young people now don't even know Kenya, don't know nothing about the day of slavery, Jim Crowism, racism. When you couldn't go in certain hotels and could sit at certain large counters and couldn't go to certain schools. And so they just take a lot of this for granted. And it bothers me because when we become complacent, relaxed, we lose. And you have to keep the heat on. Unfortunate. But it is true.
I had become deeply, deeply disenchanted, very concerned about the erosion of values as I saw, you know, those of us who came through the civil rights movement, you know, brought old-fashioned black folks' values with us because our parents had taught them to us. But what I saw that my generation was the disconnected one in one sense, because we didn't pass on to our children. We were the generation that stopped it. We didn't pass on to them in the same kind of singular fashion that our parents had passed them to us, because it's a different world. I mean, we also spent a lot of time trying to give our kids what we didn't have. And it meant spending less time with them.
Every generation complains about the generation that's in front of them, right? I listen to rap because I try to stay I want to know what the kids are doing. I know that if it's a train, the track is going to run all the way back to the spirituals, all the way around the corner to the work songs. Rap is a legitimate voice, and it's a legitimate voice of the community. And I learned enough about it to know that.
I did not want to bring up or think about all the things that I went through. And today, I still don't. I still try to put the bad things to the side. And I recognize that those things took place. I don't want to ever see them again. I don't want my children to have to go through it. I don't want children of color to go through what I went through. So that's where I've been, you know. And from there to today, I do see the need to have to tell this story because so many have missed out on why they have what they have today, and I think that we played a part in it.
As I said earlier, Ernie Green led that whole list of amazing icons whose words we were just very excited to hear because they were indeed very challenging words. And so today, we're going to endeavor to help carry on that tradition in the upcoming discussion with our panel, who are and have been seriously hands-on. And each has extensive biographies, which I encourage you to Google. But in the interest of wanting to hear from them as soon as possible and fully, and with apologies to them, I will give you just brief intros. First of all, Derrick Johnson is the 19th president and CEO of the NAACP. He has previously served as president of its Mississippi State chapter. That must have been very challenging, and vice chairman of its board of directors. Now, Lateefah Simon is the head of the Akanati Foundation, an organization supporting the development of social change movements aimed at eliminating structural racism. You're going to hear that again. She is also the recipient of the 2003 MacArthur Foundation Genius Award. Congratulations to you, Lateefah, for that. And finally, Rashad Robinson, who is president of Color of Change, an online organization with more than 1 million members. Welcome to each one of you. And we're going to get to some questions from our audience at some point, but we're going to start with you. And I don't have to tell any of you that one of the most, if not the most recurring word we hear today is historic. And to be sure, historic is accurate when describing the most votes ever cast. Historic also the turnout of Black people, and historic also the turnout of Black women in particular. And of course, the historic selection of a woman as vice president, including one with historic identities. So I'd like to begin by asking you, and I'm going to start with you, Derrick, not because you're the oldest person on the panel, but because I want to start with you. That's why I'm starting with you. And I want to ask you briefly how you personally feel about this historic moment, specifically the historic aspects I just laid out.
Well, it will only be historic if we can measure accomplishments over time. We are living in the moment, but much of what we're living in, we possibly could be taken for granted. As I was listening to Ernie Green talk about the Montgomery Bus Boycott, Martin Luther King didn't lead that boycott. He was a part of the individuals who were solicited to join the boycott. That boycott was led by E.D. Nixon. That boycott was led by Ray Parks, the husband of Rosa Parks. That boycott was led by Rosa Parks. And they have been a part of the planning and execution of many strategies over several years. And they were also being guided and supported by perhaps the most effective strategists during the civil rights movement, underappreciated, recognized, Byron Rushton. And so this may be a historic moment because we're seeing a manifestation of many activities that have taken place over several years that get us to this point, particularly after 2014, but several years prior to that. So as we look at historic, I hope we also, we don't discount the many people like the altar stars of the world who created and fertilized the ground that many of us are standing on for this current reality.
I appreciate that historical delineation there, because you're absolutely right. And thank goodness I recognize all those names. But I want to know how you personally feel at this moment, you yourself, having worked to get us here. I mean,
an outlook, right? I feel good about the trajectory that we're looking forward to 2030 and not fighting in a resistance movement against an administration that's going to be walking out the door soon, who was trying to take us back to 1950. So it puts us in a posture to be more proactive as opposed to reactive. There's much work to do. Having people elected to office are only positions. That has nothing to do with power or public policy.
Okay, that was a wonderful delineation of your own personal feelings, incorporating history into it, Derrick. So I want to move on to Lateefah and just ask you to tell me briefly your own personal reaction to this historic moment, particularly that we have the first African-American woman who is scheduled to be our vice president and possibly one day the president.
I mean, you know, as a mother of two Black daughters, there's it's clear in watching my 9-year-old look at the TV the night that Vice President-elect gave her speech. And I also really appreciate Mr. Johnson's reflection, because so much of our personal is political, is historical. And I think we're all, while we're extremely excited about the possibility of Black people, you know, having more say in how government and how the state facilitates its promise to us. I think we're also, I'm personally clear that politicians are not prophets, whether they be Black, whether they be queer, whether they be trans folks, people from my community, they're not prophets. And it's going to be up to us to remember that our journey towards history and freedom, we must not be ahistorical in that journey. So while I'm extremely excited, I'm so excited that we are also steeping ourselves in a historical journey, understanding from which we come, understanding that we're not all free. There's a lot more work to do.
Great. Well, that's a great way of putting it into some context. And Rashad, what about you and your personal reaction to this historic moment?
Yeah, no, I have a couple of feelings about it that probably mirror a lot of what Derrick and Lateefah have just said. You know, a color of change. And in my own personal activism, we say a lot all the time that we can't mistake presence for power. Presence is visibility, awareness, it's representation. Power is the ability to change the rules. And if we mistake presence for power, we can sometimes think that we've done something that we haven't actually done. We can think that a Black president means that we're post-racial. We can sometimes think that America having a whole lot of Black celebrities that we love and celebrate means that America loves Black people as much as America loves Black culture. And we know that America can love, celebrate, and monetize Black culture and hate Black people at the same time. But I'm sitting in my room here with a picture of Bayard Rustin behind me. And I, on election night, watched as Mondaire Jones and Richie Torres both won congressional seats as the first Black openly gay men to go into Congress. And I'm about 10 years older than both of them, and grew up outside of New York City and never imagined Congress to be a place that would be welcoming and opening, and even a possibility just in terms of the way that opportunity would look like for me. So representation has so much power to send a message of who belongs and what's possible. And if we see representation as a piece of the puzzle and not the whole puzzle, then we can use it for all of its values by recognizing that it's a road on the sort of, it's a step on the road towards the type of change that communities need and deserve. Representation alone doesn't actually pay the bills, doesn't actually pass policy, but representation can help us have a more foothold in getting to the place where we need to go.
Well, thank you all for those wonderful opening statements. They really do set us on a wonderful course. So let me start with you, Rashad, because I spent some time, I'm here in Florida, reporting from a predominantly Black community. And I was surprised that what turned out to be the case, that so many Black men were either not planning to vote or were voting for the person who didn't win, let's put it that way. So how do you account for that? And how much do you attribute that to an ignorance of our Black history?
Well, you know, people come to voting for all sorts of reasons. And let's be clear, Black men voted for the progressive candidates at much higher rates than any other group of men, like period. So while Black men did not perform as well in terms of voting progressive as Black women, nobody performs as well in terms of voting progressive as Black women. And Black men performed better than Asian men, Latino men, and white men. And so I think we have to start there. And I think sometimes we can start at the deficit and not actually sort of lean into to all of the ways in which was positive. Now, we have to recognize that Donald Trump appealed in deep ways to patriarchy. It depends deep ways into sort of a hierarchy of male power and male dominance. And incumbent presidents have always had a lot of tools at their disposal, from jobs to taxes to money to all sorts of visibility and platform that were absolutely used. And what we faced was an unprecedented amount of disinformation. And the thing about disinformation, which is different than misinformation are like out and out lies, like election day is being, advertised on a different day than it actually is. Disinformation actually has some elements of truth and creates the sort of ways in which people might be suppressed. And so, let's be very clear. When we go into communities and we talk about the failures of the Democratic Party, we can't, the failures to Black people, we can't pretend like that's not actually a real thing. That there haven't been failures, that there wasn't a 94 crime bill, that there weren't these issues. And so part of this is that we absolutely have more work to do. But the best way that Democrats can actually sort of lean into not losing Black voters is to actually work in an affirmative way to pass the type of policies and create the type of change that makes people's lives better. And it will force us to have to work less and spend less to actually win elections. And so that's how I see it. And I think it also bears out just in the numbers. I think there were a lot of stories about what Black men will and won't do and what Black people will or won't do. And I think in the end, the numbers prove that Black people overwhelmingly voted for the most progressive candidate, well beyond any of the other groups.
Great. Do you have anything to add to that, Derrick Johnson?
Absolutely. What other community have the burden of being in absolute unison, 100% support behind anything? That has not been placed on any other community. Whether you say 19% or 9%, we will start with that number as opposed to 81% of African-American men supported a particular candidate, or 91%, whatever number you use. Let's start from that frame and then ask why. But then you take it even further. Why is it that we would repeat a narrative that, one, based on exit polls, have always been unreliable, period, of any group, and two, diminish the power of our vote and our ability to lean into what Na'im Akbar called collective consciousness? It's clear that white supremacy was on the ballot. It's clear that the last 3.5 years have been nothing but an attack on who we are as individuals. It's clear that the harboring of a Steve Miller in the White House is a direct threat to our existence. So why would we focus on the negative narrative of what some people didn't do, that based on data that's not true, when the reality is we stood up in this moment like we've never stood up before, because we recognize that our future, our children, our women, our men was under direct attack. And this democracy will be destroyed but for Black folks once again standing up to save it.
Very fascinating analysis there. And I want to come to Lateefah, And yeah, let me ask you this, Lateefah. I see you shaking your head, and I heard you giving an amen in the room.
Yeah.
So I assume that you agree with what both Rashad and Derrick have said. And something Derrick said interested me. He talked about disinformation and misinformation. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that and the role that the media played and continue to play in delineating what is going on with African Americans in this country.
You know, I'll speak to this shortly, hopefully quickly. White supremacy, it runs in the veins of every institution and frankly in both political parties. I am extremely proud of Black folks, not just in November, but if we look at the trajectory of change in this country, and I even think about in California, African-American men led a referendum campaign to ensure that men and women who have had history in the criminal justice system could have the right to vote, and really led a historic feat. Proposition 17 created a new opportunity for folks who have been deeply disenfranchised and their rights to democracy stolen from them. I refuse to hear these snippets that are calculated misinformation targets, diminishing the power of community, diminishing the power of the Black male organizer, of the factory worker, of the father. I think we need to be very wary. Again, how both parties look at, support who we are. I think we have a lot to be proud of. I think we have a long way to go. But, you know, again, has the Democratic or Republican Party stepped up to really deal with how they for so long have diminished the power and the place of Black men? I refuse to take this moment as an opportunity to further divide a group of people who are not, by the way, monolithic, but we are moving in a very powerful direction. Let's not take the bait.
Right. That's a good point you make, because you hear analysis of the recent vote and you hear generalizations about Latin Americans. And I keep saying to people, but there's more than one kind of Latin American. There's more than one, you know, so break it down. So let me stay with you for a minute, because Joyce Ladner, you heard her, she wasn't identified, but she was, I think, the last one who spoke in that panel about how we didn't pass on to our children our history. Do you agree with that? Because you are currently involved in preserving materials for the next generation. What do you think about how well this generation, the next generation, is being prepared and has been prepared up to now? Which includes, by the way, I think some of those men that I interviewed, they were younger men who were getting misinformation, the kind that Derrick referred to.
I mean, we've heard this narrative. My grandmother would say the same thing. You know, you children don't know what we know. Here's what I do know. Let me tell you, here's what I do know. Never before have you seen unadulterated messages of Black power across class within the African American community. The culmination of a radicalized movement that is 400 years old is being it's being midwifed. I think that in this moment you have young people, Black folk, in the center of not only a new conversation, but a new reality about justice, about fairness, about class and racial justice and equity. So on every paper in the United States today, in every big city, on the front page, there is a narrative talking about race. There is a narrative talking about white supremacy and the over-policing of communities. Young people from around this country, whether they be in Detroit, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, New York, Florida, urban or rural, are in conversations, and whether it's locker rooms or on the corners, in classrooms, in prisons, and in their homes, in all the conditions that make up the United States. And they're very clear on a politic that they deserve better. So I actually, again, denounce the lexicon that young people aren't politicized. In fact, not only are they politicized, they're angry, they're strategic, but they're extremely hopeful. And I always say that young people across the country, regardless of their economic stature, regardless how hard the foot of capitalism is on their neck, they actually believe that they deserve better. They are people of faith. Whether they pray or not, they believe in something so much bigger than, in fact, many of the elders in my family. They don't believe that their station in life right now is where they should be. And so for that, I think we should be actually inspired by young people who are putting their bodies on the line every single day, whether they be organized or whether they're leaving work at the gas stations to go to demand for justice in their downtowns. So again, we think of the Greensboros young people 60 years ago. Those young people, again, folks didn't believe in the North Star that they believed in, but they knew that their mother and father couldn't walk in the front door of a public space. Young people, again, are giving us that same North Star now, and they want more, and they want what they deserve. So I'm proud actually of this generation, and super inspired that they're going to lead us, not just more left, but they're going to lead us forward.
That's so interesting to hear, because so many of the people I talk to who are my age, which is a lot older than any of you, but my age and even younger are so despondent. And I think part of it is because while you do hear a narrative about sort of like what you were talking about, at the same time, far too many people of color, when you look at the data on COVID, or you look at the economy and right now, and the number of people who are losing their jobs and who have no health insurance, that keeps so many people not in the same hopeful vein that you just expressed. So how do we get to a discussion that's significant and impactful across a broad spectrum of people who have some ability to do something about it, about this systemic racism? Derrick, can you speak to that?
Sure. One of the things that frustrates me the most is our inability to manage success successfully. The fact that we've made progress, we continue to make progress. We have more young people engaged than we have seen in the history of this nation, and they're doing so without fear. I know Joyce Ladner. I've learned so much from her. And where I disagree with her, I understand her point of reference, because she was a part of the students who had led the way, and she felt that she could have given even more than what she's given. But what she has given, what her sister Dory has given, what Cortland Cox and so many have given, is a rich history of activism that's rooted in a community-centric approach, not egocentric, not about the Messiah, one that's going to come save us, but the ability to know that all of us are ordinary people who can do extraordinary things. And so as we continue down this journey, we must make sure that our generation, the generation after us, and the generation after them. I have a whole group of young people who are, quote, millennials, and I'm telling them now, you're 30, you're 31, you're 32, you're old now, because there's a whole nother group that we need to go and make sure that we empower, that they understand that the benchmark of where they're starting was fought for. So now their platform is much more broader and stable than the platform that came before them, and it's their responsibility to continue it. But it's not about social media celebrity. That's not about the most charismatic speaker. It is not about the person that everybody say, that's the Messiah, because that's a trap that has caused us to fail. It is about the collective whole and understanding that all of us have something to offer. And if we bring our pieces of the solution and we put it in the center of the village and share it, that our pieces become the whole solution that we can build on.
You know, you hear about the young people this or the old people don't know. And I said, well, how about a coalition of the generations so that the younger generation can learn from this older generation and the generation before them. Do you agree with that?
Can I just say real quick, our movement has always been successful when they were intergenerational. We have never won a struggle that was singular in terms of the generational approach. Intergenerational is the ingredients to our success.
Rashad, you agree?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think I agree with that. I also think that, you know, we've also just got to be critical about the strategies that need to change over time, depending on the context that we're in. You know, I do think that as I sit inside of focus groups of young Black folks who grew up in an era where they had a Black president, there is much more pushback on the kind of the ways in which Black faces in high places can be sort of a strategy for the type of structural and systemic change. Oftentimes, I hear folks say structural and systemic change and then shift over to talking about representation. And those are two different things. And I think it's really important that we sort of recognize that there was generations and decades of Black people making huge pathways into segregated structures that were previously barred us from. We made huge gains in diversifying police departments in corporate America, in all of these places which had previously not allowed us in. And I think we have to be both critical on what it allowed us to gain, which plenty was gained, and what wasn't gained from that. And being much more critical and thoughtful about the ongoing way in which rule changes need to happen. I do think that, as my good friend, Professor Dorian Warren says, we don't want a rainbow oligarchy. And I think we have to sort of recognize all of the ways in which structural change has really been at the heart of this movement. And that looks different than a theory of change about Black faces in high places. And I say that sort of growing up and really sort of believing in that idea, but also seeing the deep limitations and the limitations that are very clear when you've had a Black president, and you can see that we've gotten there, and we see all the ways in which so many of the structures did not change and could not change just because we were in the room. And in fact, some ways it shores up systems which are meant to harm us. And so it does mean that we have to tell more stories that don't make inequality look unfortunate like a car accident, but actually translates people understanding to how unjust it is. So we move from the sort of charitable solutions to structural problems and actually focus on the structural challenges that far too often hold us back. And when Lateefah was talking about so much of this sort of current movement's focus on structural change, whether it is looking at the funding models of police departments, whether it is holding corporations accountable at the highest levels, it's sort of recognizing all of the ways in which the system is not broken. In fact, it is operating exactly the way it was designed. And us just getting inside of a system that was designed to hurt, harm, and targeting us is not actually going to change it. We have to actually structurally change the system. And that's just obviously rooted in a deep appreciation from all of those that came before us and all of the ways in which they got us to the place where we could focus on the type of rule and structural changes, because we sort of moved a whole lot of other change in other places.
I think it's fascinating that you mentioned having a Black president. And I think, Lateefah, did you or Derrick, I'm having trouble remembering everything because you're so profound in your analysis. But I watched him recently, Barack Obama, on 60 Minutes, and he continued to stress that our union was always set up moving towards a more perfect union. It wasn't set up to be perfect. So what you're all talking about are people like yourselves and others who are engaged in moving the country towards a more perfect union. So let me go back to you, Lateefah, and ask if you can briefly tell us a little bit about the work of the Akanati Foundation and whether you are currently preserving materials for the next generation and how you are doing it?
You know, I think that's Mr. Johnson's job. No, I'm joking. I'm being facetious. Our work at the Akanati Foundation is to fund racial justice movements. And Oakland in particular, Oakland is deep soiled, as you know, the founding space of the Black Panther Party. The moniker of defund the police literally rose up from movement there in the streets of Oakland. I think about the journey that I've had from being an activist and an organizer to moving to philanthropy, lifting up some of those stories that were told to me by, Dr. Clarence Jones. If we believe truly that a movement should move us forward, the folks who are sacrificing so much to be that light should be resourced. And so we're funding people of color to sort of rip down the walls of racism structurally in Oakland. But I need to say something, the conversation that we're having, which Rashad has put it so beautifully, Black folks in high places will not, meaning in elected positions, will not sort of be the rallying call for justice and freedom in this country. I believe that it's a part of the conversation. I think having a Black woman as the second in command of one of the most powerful nations in the world is exemplary. And I do think that there will be not only a new conversation, but forward action, because we know that those folks in the White House can be pushed and can be organized. That being said, more resource, more acknowledgement needs to be put in place to not only reestablish the resources for venerable organizations, and as well to ensure that organizations, we move through organizations in life, whether it be your church or whether it be, again, your LDF, or whether it be your NAACP, and Color of Change, and I can name many others. But my role in this movement now is to facilitate much needed resources to the folks who really do believe in this thing called democracy, who really do believe that we can one day experience and see and taste this thing called liberation, where Black children could not just be tolerated in schools, but be celebrated, where your mother and your uncle, when they go to get healthcare, that they will be loved and cherished as if they are truly someone's grandmother or grandfather. From every issue we can think about, Black people are still fighting for our just due. So my work.
Let me just ask you about specifically, though, about how your work is promoting that, preserving that history and promoting that history.
It's giving money to people to be able to be agitators. Okay. I work for a philanthropic institution where the most important thing that we can do is resource leaders and institutions like the brothers on this phone who have stepped out. Again, we believe that leaders have the answers, and philanthropic institutions do not. Our job is to fund and to resource the thought leaders, the Black and brown thought leaders of this moment. That's what I'm doing.
And that's very good. And Rashad, are you recording digital? Are you putting the work that you're doing and history into digital forms, or how are you preserving the kind of history that will inspire new generations?
Yes, so Color of Change, driven by 7.2 million members, Black folks and allies of every race. We work, in the digital space every single day. Our founding was just a little over 15 years ago, so we were squarely inside the digital space. We have a studio in our New York office. How I miss going into an office. I may be the only one, but I miss getting up and getting dressed and going to the office. But I say that to say that we do a whole lot of work, not just in capturing and doing storytelling of our own. Last year, Color of Change was nominated for 4 Webby Awards and won 2, which is sort of like the Emmys of the internet in terms of sort of digital production. And we produce a lot of video and storytelling. We also work in Hollywood and both pressure from the outside, but also engage in the writers' rooms of Hollywood. And so we're in about 25 to 30 writers' rooms right now across Hollywood inside of crime procedural shows and types of other shows that sort of showcase and tell the story of Black people, working to insert storylines, work in the storytelling. And so when I think about sort of the telling the story of now in the most authentic and full portrayal, I'm thinking about what do the crime procedural shows actually do in terms of the storytelling of the role of police unions, the role of racial justice movements in the narrative storytelling, the entertainment storytelling, which maybe far more people will ever see than some of the best documentaries. How are we in this moment creating the right level of storytelling that gives people not just the ability to understand, but the ability to act? And then finally, when I think about storytelling, I think this is really important to so much of what Lateefah has said and what Derrick has said, is that far too many of our storytelling and so much of the storytelling that comes from the outside of our community talks about the community in an active voice and talks about the systems in a passive voice. And we are working, every single day at Color of Change to really try to shift that sort of way in which those stories are told. And so the quick example of that and why I believe this is so important is far too often we will hear things like Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank, instead of banks are less likely to give loans to Black people. We heard Black women are less likely to get hired into corporate America, instead of corporate America excludes Black women. I know that may seem like a simple turn of phrase in the type of storytelling and the ways in which we tell story. But if you look at the bank sort of example, Black people are less likely to get loans from a bank means that we get a lot of financial literacy programs. Banks are less likely to give loans to Black people means that we work on structural change to actually deal with the banks, which from their very beginning have excluded, targeted us, redlined us. On one hand, in the job conversation, we will get pipeline and mentorship programs for Black women instead of actually dealing with racism and misogyny inside of corporate America. And so dealing through our storytelling, it's not simply for us that we tell more stories. It's that we put the voice in the right place. So we stop spending all of our time trying to fix Black people and Black families and spend more of our time trying to fix the structures and the systems that harm and hurt us. In so many ways, at scale, I believe that can be one of those powerful offerings from a 21st century civil rights organization like Color of Change, which uses and develops and engages in technology every day since our founding, is that we can give people the storytelling designed to empower action. And we can work with our partners across the field to do that at scale in all sorts of powerful ways. So that's really sort of how I think both about what does it mean to both capture the story of now and what does it mean to give people the tools to make the right decisions, to move from caring, understanding to real action.
I'm going to quote you a lot on that one, Rashad. Let me just go quickly back to you, Derrick. And, because no organization has the longevity and richness of civic engagement as the NAACP. I believe most of the NAACP's collection is, in fact, now at the Library of Congress. What can our young social activists learn from this collection or the history of the work of the NAACP?
I think the most important part concerning the legacy of the NAACP, we are member-led. We are structured like a Baptist church, not like a connectional Methodist church. There's no bishop sitting the edict down and people conform. It is driven by all of the many voices that make up our membership, that form our units, whether it's a branch in a county or a municipal or college chapter, youth council, that inform our policy priorities for a particular year. That's really important. It is the most community-centric small d organization that exists outside of the Baptist church. Now, with small d democracy, that can be good and bad depending on how people steward their reality in that given moment. And if you allow people to come in and hijack the voice of the many, you have problems. If you allow the many to really drive the voice of the collective, you have opportunity. That is the success of the NAACP. It is through that stewardship that we've seen time after time in local communities, the emergence of progressive approaches and policies. And that's something that young people have to learn from. It's not about the singular one, because we are not a monolith. It is about the collective whole. That's who we are structurally, and that's how we must continue to be looking into the future.
And you have these you have records from the organization that are at the library.
Oh yeah, we started the relationship with Library of Congress sometime in the mid-'80s when Benjamin Hooks was in place, because people began to recognize the value of the archival material. And the NAACP archive material is the largest collection within the Library of Congress as it stands today. But in addition to that, going back to Joyce Ladner, we're also part of the conversation with the SNCC Legacy Project so we can digitize their papers. And it's a partnership that we have fostered with Duke University and Tougaloo College at HBCU, because what was going on with all of the papers of the SNCC veterans, they had all of this rich information and it wasn't comfortable with just giving it anywhere to anybody, because those were some of the most progressive and radical voices of our community, and a very diverse group of individuals who were skilled in their ability to move change under the stewardship of the elders who were World War II veterans in many cases, and had to flee the country. Joyce Ladner had left the country and she went to Ethiopia. Bob Moses and Cortland Cox, they went to Tanzania. You had Willie Ricks who ended up going to Uganda before he had to get out of there. Gideon Fasay was with Stokely Carmichael. So many went to Ghana because they began to see the movement of our people as a global movement concerning the African diaspora. Yes, we'd say this country is about perfecting democracy, but in our community, we also say that freedom is a constant struggle. Yes. And with that constant struggle, there's this linkage between all of our generations, all of our skills. We cannot exclude anybody, but we must learn from what has been created in the past so we don't make the old mistakes, because we have enough new mistakes to make. We must create opportunities to understand from those old mistakes so we can push forward and continue to grow as a community, as an African diaspora.
Okay, Rashad, let me just ask you, when you do look back and listening to Derrick talk about what's in the Library of Congress from the NAACP, what do you want to carry forth from our history, Black history, to the young people in particular that you're addressing these days?
So, I think one thing that's always really helpful is the ways in which we are learning from and connecting and sharing strategy. I remember as an early 20-something activist, hearing a lot of the stories of SNCC from some of the leaders. And so I got to know, the late Julian Bond, who was a leader in SNCC and obviously became the chairman of the NAACP. And it was a story that Mr. Bond told me that still stays with me today in terms of even how sort of I talk about sort of the evolution of strategy as it relates to technology and our use of technology. And it was the story of SNCC installing the Watts line in the Shore University office, and Watts being the precursor to the 1-800 number that allowed SNCC to bypass those Ma Bell operators that were largely controlled by the White Citizens Council in the South, and be able to move phone calls much quicker and not have to deal with the operator to operator to operator calls that long distance calls at the time sort of required. If SNCC didn't have a theory of change, if they didn't have a power analysis, they could have had Twitter or Facebook or all sorts of other technology. It was the fact that they had a deep understanding of power, a strategy, that they had people willing to follow them and they could overlay the technology. I think a story like that, right, unlocks sort of a deep understanding of how different generations thought about leveraging technology and tools. I also thought it was always great when I would hear from younger activists at the time about how much critique they got from generations before them in terms of their strategies and their tactics. How many folks were not actually for the lunch counter sit-ins, not just the larger American public, but in fact, within the civil rights movement, within Black elected spaces. How many people pushed back against it, thought it was actually not the right strategy, that they could sort of lose the movement if they moved too quickly. I think like all of this is actually important so that we can sometimes mistake elected officials for our movement, Black elected officials for our movement leaders, with recognizing that they have a role to play. We can sometimes think business leaders or celebrities are our movement leaders, when celebrities like Harry Belafonte spent their time really trying to take the lead from activists on the ground and spent a lot of time figuring out how they could support. I think history gives us so much of an insight when we actually pay attention and lean into the strategic underpinnings that sort of animated people's actions. We can actually take a lot away in terms of how we can think about our path forward, while always overlaying it and applying it to the current context we live in, and also being critical about what worked and didn't work. I also don't want us to think that like everything that happened before was perfect and it worked. Right. There were a lot of people that were excluded, that were kept out, that were not allowed to have voice or platform. And that is also part of how the movement today has been very different in terms of whose stories get centered and included, who gets fought for, who gets left behind. All of these are part of how we have to sort of recognize the role of history. It's not just holding everything up from our past as if it all was perfect and worked. It is holding all of those complications.
Yes. But it's also important who's recording that history as well.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I would ask all of us to do, if you get an opportunity this week, to go to your downtown. And throughout the cities and towns in the United States, and frankly, all over the world. If you look at Paris and London and Australia, and you think about the brown and black skin artists who have used this opportunity of both a racial reckoning and a global pandemic to paint justice through our downtowns on those boards that are boarding up the city streets, that the archival nature of movement, I just want to be clear, is not only external, it is also happening in a digital space. Okay, so whether it be, me waking up almost every morning listening to my sister Patrice talk about, sort of what's on and cracking in LA, or us tuning in and listening to conversations with young people in Louisiana, sort of moving a dialogue, again, to downtown Oakland, it looks like a movement museum. So there is, and I just want to be very, very clear, a very deep communication strategy that is robust and is, again, not monolithic throughout this moment, throughout this movement moment. In fact, we have brothers and sisters and people and folks in the academy, and you have folks on street corners who are every single moment are calculating and thinking and recording how we are all collectively moving. And that collectivity is diasporic in its nature itself. So I want to be clear, and to Rashad's point, the many, many voices, the many, many experiences of how this nation, and frankly, the globe, because I think many of these activists and organizers, as we talk about the civil rights movement, many of those leaders were also internationalists. We're thinking about sort of the globe as one and how we move forward. We're breathing the same air, let's be clear, and we're drinking the same water. We are thinking and we are learning from, again, the pluses, deltas, roses, and thorns. But what is important, and I'll end here, is that the archiving of the movement is alive and well, and it is in the digital space, it is on the streets, it is in your museums, it is in the papers of young people at historically Black colleges. It's everywhere. And so I think in 30 years, we will be able to say what was happening and who was working in the civil rights movement of 2020-21.
Derrick, you want to add something to that?
I think both Rashad and I think it was right on point. The archival of our moment and our history continues to evolve, and it evolves in so many ways. And we have to embrace. Our movement cannot be hijacked with someone else's narrative around this Messiah complex. Because I always go back to that. I truly believe we got off track from understanding the history and the significance of our movement, because we'll allow a set of individuals to hijack it by saying, Martin Luther King is the leader here, or this is the way to do it, or this is the avenue you have to go, when oftentimes our successful movement were the minority within our community going against the grain of what was considered the way to go. Ella Baker left the NAACP because she got sick of chauvinism. She didn't agree with Thurgood Marshall's approach that everything should happen within the courts. You have Bayard Rustin, who was isolated in the back room because he was openly gay, and he should have been, but yet he was the most creative genius strategically of the movement. You had individuals who would malign what was going on in Mississippi. Roy Wilkins said, you know, why would anybody want to go there? But it was those World War II veterans, Medgar Evers and Aaron Henry, to say, no, we're going to take to the street and we're going to come up with another strategy. Martin Luther King showed up at the New Jersey 64 convention to try to convince Fannie Lou Hamer and Aaron Henry not to pursue a course of challenging the white Democrats, and they refused to do so. He did that because the labor unions were saying, hey, we're paying you, we're giving you money, therefore you got to stop what's coming out of Mississippi. Martin Luther King did not want to go to Birmingham, and it was only because John Lewis was courageous enough. And even with John Lewis going to Birmingham, you had Karen Sparrow and Curlin Cox who didn't want to do Birmingham because they said, we're not going to get hit in our head again. We're going to go to Lowndes County and we're going to operate the Black Panther Party to give folks to understand that now we have the right to vote out of Mississippi. We're going to control the vote in Lowndes County. Those are counterculture movements that were successful that people begin to embrace and rest their laurels on. We also must understand organizations are vehicles for social justice voices. They're not the social justice movement. They're only vehicles. Our ability to ensure that we create the space, whether it's Color Change or NAACP or you name the organization, is to maintain and mature those vehicles using the tools of technology, because technology is not the movement. They're only tools. And so when we right size where we're going, freedom is a constant struggle, but that struggle has to be impregnated with strategy. And that strategy needs to be leveraged with individuals who are courageous enough to go against the culture to make the change that's necessary.
I'm also wondering about a stat that I heard back from Southern Poverty Law Center. That's right, Julian Bond was once associated with that. 85% of the schools in this country don't teach Black history. How do you change that? I mean, that's just pretty amazing. If we're going to create a new generation who are as conscious as each of you and of those you're trying to reach, if it's not being taught in the schools, what do? Rashad?
It's power and accountability. The people who get to write the rules get to write the rules. And that's why we have to build power. And that's why institutions like NAA and Color of Change and so many of our groups are working to build power. Because
but I'm saying, how do you get this into the schools to these young
that's what I am saying. I'm saying the schools, if the schools are not doing it, it's because of power, right? The school, whose stories get told, our story is about power. These are all about power, right? And so yes, and I feel like sometimes we try to like have this conversation without actually having conversations about power. And I think it's very important strategically, because this is a place where I think we make a lot of mistakes, where we come up with a lot of ideas and wraparounds to get around the fact that at the end of the day, the barriers that are standing in the way of whether it's not having our stories taught in public education in schools where we pay taxes, or whether it's being protected and safe on our streets, those are conversations about power. And that is why institutions like ours have to build the type of power that changes the rules and forces those that are in power to be nervous about disappointing our community. If they're not nervous about disappointing our community, if we don't have the ability to change the rules, we can have all sorts of conversations about what it means to teach our history, but we won't actually be able to pull the levers to make it happen.
Well, and I think that what's important about what Rashad is saying, it is power is central to the answer, because in California, it did take an African-American professor who ran for office and who has been in office for many years, Dr. Shirley Reber, to put legislation in front of a body that has not seen us as human beings, to say ethnic studies at its core must be taught both at the community college level and must be taught in the public at the public level in the CSU and the UC system. That took power, and that took a lot of organizing and clarity. We can have great ideas, but unless we actually have not only an elected, but a movement surrounding that elected to move both legislation and implementation, we're just having conversation. So thank you, Rashad.
I can see that Derrick agrees with that, right, Derrick?
Absolutely. We rely too much on the transaction of an election and not the building of a movement that goes to power, the capacity to make things happen or stop things from happening. Governmental entities like a school district or municipality, we need to see ourselves in the center of owning those institutions and not being victims of those institutions. And what ownership is through our tax dollars, we define the rules of engagements, the guardrails that are allowed or prohibited. And that's inclusive of the textbooks that are purchased, the information that's shared. That's really important. That's going from a Selma getting hit across the head on a bridge to a Lowndes County controlling the mechanisms of power. People, Lowndes County is impoverished. Yes, it is, but they have the ability to control. And that's what we need to move towards. How do we control what we control and not rely on the concepts of conversation, but really go deep and control all of who we are in our agency and our stewardship and make the outcome reflect our needs and our interests.
Well, thank you so much, Derrick. I want to thank each one of you for this very stimulating conversation, because frankly, I don't have another page in my notebook to write down all the suggestions and ideas that you've come up with. They were just amazing. And so I want to thank you for your contribution. So we're going to now go to our panel for their questions. And this committee includes sociologist Cora Masters-Berry, retired civil service administrator for the United States National Park Service, Robert Stanton. We have the Wise Foundation founder, Jacqueline Copeland. We have a scholar, Howard Dodson, and a dear friend. I haven't seen him in a long time, so I'm eager to see him on this panel. Academic administrator, Ramona Edlin, whom I've known a very long time. Our nonprofit executives, Christine James Brown, Maura McLean, and Laura Murphy. And a member of the Little Rock Nine, Carlotta Lanier, and another dear friend, economist Julianne Malveaux. And now we have one of our nonprofit executives, Laura Murphy, who will ask the first question. Laura?
Hi, thank you, Charlayne. It's a pleasure to meet you, Lateefah, and it's great seeing Derrick and Rashad. And my question is for Derrick and Rashad. So much emphasis has been placed since the election on what Congress and elected bodies can get accomplished in this highly partisan environment. But one of the things that has been most exciting in my work with both of you, having led the civil rights audit of Airbnb and Facebook, is how much emphasis and focus you've been putting on the private sector to deliver real change. And I would like both Rashad and my dear friend, Mr. Johnson, to talk about how they are prioritizing their work as far as the governmental sector work and the private sector work. How are you approaching the challenges of our time?
So good to see you, Laura, always. And I miss the world where we got to see each other in person more. But that's such a great question, and such an important question as we think about sort of what type of strategies in this current reality are going to have to be applied in order to make good on the electoral sort of engagement. I've been talking about this last election as the sort of way in which racial justice became a majoritarian issue, right? We saw the spikes over the summer in voter registration among young Black folks, and racial justice is a majoritarian issue. Black people are not the majority, but racial justice is a majoritarian issue. The path ahead of us, though, is to making sure it's a governing majority. And making it a governing majority means that we actually have to build power across a number of different sectors. It doesn't matter if we have a good idea going to Congress if there's all sorts of corporate enablers that stand in the way of it. And so just like we have to place pressure on corporations, and this isn't simply about calling corporations out, it's actually about building leverage to actually push and engage corporations to do the things that we need. So not every corporations are the same. Some are going to be able to be on the inside and push on the inside, and some are going to have to play on the outside. At Color of Change, we've been really doing a couple of things. One, we've built this program called Beyond the Statement. This summer, many corporations said Black Lives Matter, and now we've tried to build out a campaign, Now What? And Beyond the Statement is very much a focus at pushing corporations around a whole set of key demands. We're working in Hollywood on two initiatives called Change Hollywood and Change Music, which are about roadmaps in those industries which have such far reach and have such sort of impact over our lives and the larger culture, to do things like inclusion riders, which provide very clear metrics around who is included and who is profiting off of sort of our intellect, our knowledge, our creativity. And then we are going to be working to amplify the role of our allies. You know, corporations, right, once again, who spoke out in favor of racial justice, in order to make it a governing majority, we can't just have them say that they care. We have to move them to action. And so now it's going to be time to hear from those corporations when the criminal justice bill is being stalled, and them going to the Republican senators who rely on their campaign contributions, and them putting the type of pressure they put on those folks when a tax policy bill comes up or something else comes up that they say benefits them. This will about making sure that people's words are met with actual action. And that is the power of organizing. It's the power of mobilization. And that's what we're going to be doing. And then we're going to be trying to continue to apply the right levels of strategy. The brilliant work that you have led around civil rights audits is so important, and working across many different corporations to have them do the civil rights audit, which is so important to get the diagnosis of these institutions so that then we can actually move to the type of changes. You don't know how to solve the problem if you don't actually know what the problem is. And we need to be able to do that in more of these places. Finally, and I think most importantly, we have to continue to raise the bar for what's acceptable. You know, the last 4 years can make us think that just because someone doesn't yell at us or say the most offensive things, that they're not that bad. And we have to get back to a standard about what does it mean to be in support of our community? What does it mean to be our friend? Because we can't let the sort of last 4 years of racist bullhorn from the White House color our sort of understanding of what does it mean to be an ally of our community. We can't just go back. We have to go forward.
Did you want to add to that, Derrick?
Sure. And Laura, I want to thank you for being a great thought partner for all your work in the movement space. You know, corporations have profound responsibility, not only because they enabled the last 4 years, but they have participated and benefited from structural and systemic racism for the last 2 centuries or greater. And in many cases, they benefited because of their predatory practices in the Black community. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. And insurance companies have benefited mightily. So one street, that's the border between Detroit and Dearborn. And if you go right across this 4-lane highway, very small street, the housing prices differ substantially because the real estate industry devalued the property in Detroit and increased property in Dearborn. The cost of living differed drastically. The insurance companies almost tripled the cost of insurance on homes on the Detroit side of the street, and is much less on the Dearborn side of the street. The cost of insurance for cars, those are corporate benefits that are deeply rooted in public policy that allow them to do that. When you look at some of the social media platforms, Rashad and I, we're in the midst of a campaign now. They have benefited because of the lack of regulation or the non-existent regulations, helping foster the floor for white supremacist behavior that has really caused harm to our community. So there's no separation, in my opinion, between public advocacy work and the private advocacy work, because in the public advocacy work, it's all about who gets taxed, who's not taxed, and what those tax dollars are spent on, and how corporations rally the troops to support candidates to carry forward their tax policy have been divisive, to say the least. The tools of race and religion has consistently been used. If you want to move a set of individuals to vote against their interests, you embed conversation with a racialized argument that has false in its nature and based in white supremacy. You get people to vote against their interests so the elected official can adopt tax policy to benefit you. You want to move a conversation where race is a tool, but you want to use the questions of morality. You talk about same-sex marriage, or you talk about the right of a woman to choose, so you can move a set of individuals to who are so brainwashed they will vote against their interests, and it's all about tax policy. So you cannot separate the two. And we're about to walk into a new Congress that's going to be divided, going to be intentionally harmful. And we know it's going to be divided because when they had the first 2 years of this administration tenure, both houses and branches all control one party, and they didn't move anything at that time either. And so as we push conversation to address structural racism, Lateefah said it best. White supremacy, they don't have a political party. White supremacy exists in both political parties. So it's incumbent upon us to push the narrative to get to the place where we understand the question around power is about money. The issue about money is tax policy, or the cost of labor, or the denying of access to resources, or the suffocating of those who can compete in the market space against the white community, where you suffocate their ability to add value to who we are as a community. That is a 360 approach.
Thank you so much, Derrick. And I thought we were about to lose Howard Dodson, but he was just turning on the light so he could shine a little brighter. So Howard, let's have your question.
Yes, I wanted to follow up on Derrick's comment about power and the centrality of it in this. And I'm reminded of the fact that people thought SNCC operated as a kind of fly-by-night organization, but they had a research function that was centered on doing power analyses of the communities they were going into. And I'm asking, my question is, do we have sufficient research functions in support of the strategies that we're moving for, developing now, especially in these areas of systemic racism? There's the spread is extraordinary, but do we have sufficient sound information, not only to know what's there, but to know where the weaknesses are and to know where we can move to transform that situation?
All right, I actually, that's a fantastic question. And I'd like to hear each of the panelists briefly address it, because I think that each of you probably has an answer to it, right? Let's start with, did you say Rashad first, Howard?
Yes, I did.
Rashad, briefly?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that, you know, if I think about sort of centrality of power, and I think of research, right? Oftentimes when I talk about the secret of success of some of the best color of change campaigns, I think about one as having a very clear strategic insight, right? What is the lever that we need to pull that by pulling it actually is a force multiplier for change, right? And research is required, right? Like when we took on the American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC, and all the ways in which they were advancing stand your ground and voter ID laws and other things that hurt, it was that understanding that 98% of ALEC's money came from corporations, and knowing that if we pressed on the corporate lever of going after corporations that were sponsoring ALEC, it was going to be a force multiplier towards moving towards some results. If 30% of Alec's money came from corporations, moving towards corporate accountability might not have been the right lever to pull because it wouldn't have had the same type of impact on the structures. It's understanding of having very clear media sort of savvy. It's understanding the role of deep research beyond the strategic insight, being able to sort of fully understand the scope of the sort of places where interventions can be made. And of course, it's about having an organized constituency, and more than ever, we leverage research for that. So there's different types of research that we think about at Color of Change. I think there's different types of research that folks are thinking about across the movement. There's, of course, the sort of academic, sort of large-scale research that looks at the problem as a whole. Then there's the sort of more organizing campaign research that identifies the levers, pushes people to pull, helps us build sort of power over our targets, and allows us to move the needle. Then there's the sort of data and analytics that we've built out at Color of Change to really sort of both understand what's driving participation, how do we maximize participation. And we have a data team of about, I guess, close to 7, 8 people now on the team that really does work every day to both understand how we are maximizing engagement, participation, how we are sort of moving in different communities, what messages are resonating and are not resonating to maximize sort of engagement. I don't think anything in the movement is at the necessary scale to fight back 400 years of oppression. But do I think that we have learned a lot and are building a lot in terms of what does it mean to both understand research and have the sort of systems to apply it in the ways that actually force the type of change that we need? I think we are very much sort of moving in the right direction. And I think about all the ways in which a lot of the voter engagement and voter participation organizations this year maximize the role of research and had to maximize the role of research and data in really both understanding how we were going to reach, how we were going to engage, and how we were going to move on voter engagement work in the middle of a pandemic where we couldn't reach our people the same ways, and which many of the data sets that we rely on are not as accurate since the housing crisis and all the ways in which our communities have become less contiguous. And so I think all of those things play themselves out, but research very much is a part of how we think about it. And one thing I'll just say, if anyone who gets a Color of Change email, you'll see there's always multiple footnotes in those emails. And those footnotes are just one more way in which we try to highlight to our members the backstory of the work that we are doing to come to both the conclusion, the ask, and sort of the theory of change behind the campaigns that we're driving.
Okay, Rashad, thank you so much. Can you, either of you, Derrick or Lateefah, want to briefly add to that, or do you think the question was answered? Because if so, we have one more question from our audience.
I was going to briefly add to that, and just telling just a 2-minute story. The first campaign, one of the first campaigns I won as a young executive director of a movement organization, the Young Women's Freedom Center, in my 20s, was when we learned that young Black and brown girls, when they were being arrested, those who were pregnant, who were serving time in juvenile hall, not jail or prison, juvenile hall, who were children themselves, when pregnant, incarcerated girls were giving birth, they were being chained to their beds. And the leader of that probation department was a Black man, and he was the one signing those orders. What was clear to us as young people who were system involved, who were leading this power building organization, that we were going to need not only data, we were going to need an organizing strategy. And frankly, it was the National Association for Obstetricians who came. And what I understood, we won that campaign and stopped this practice in the late 90s in San Francisco, not the 70s, but the late 90s in San Francisco. What I understand from that and many other campaigns that I've led and won, and now that I fund, is that grassroots groups are deserving of powerful data, of researchers, of excellent communication strategies and resources to move, identify power, and identify those levers. and to be able to win their campaigns. Successful organizing campaigns must be centered in data and in research, but data and research alone are not going to build the power base. And so if you think about movement like a flower with your base in the middle and all of the things that you need, those petals, to be able to fuel a movement, Rashad is right. And one of the things that is so powerful about NAA and so powerful about Color of Change, they're very clear about that. They are centered on providing resources, data, consistent communication support to small and large organizations in cities and towns throughout the country who are fighting for racial justice. So thank you, brothers, for that work.
Thank you both on that. Derrick, if you could just hold on a minute, because we're gonna run out of time, and I do want to get Carlotta Lanier in here because she comes from a very historic place in our lives. I'm sure that we all know that history. I certainly do. As a member of the Little Rock Nine, I'm so happy to have you in this program. So what is your question, my dear?
Well, thank you, Charlayne, and thank you, all three of those on the panel here. It has been quite enriching. We have such, I spend time speaking with young people throughout the country, whether it's high school or colleges, and we have such rich African-American history. But what would you say, any of the three, would say is most like today, with all of our history of African Americans and our various movements that we have had throughout, say, the past 60 to 100 years?
Okay, now let me just ask you, as we entertain this very fascinating question, we just have a short period left. So let me start with you, Derrick, in answer to that question. And if we could make it brief so that we could hear from each of the other panelists so that we get everybody's answer on this fascinating question. Derrick?
Our history and our ability to struggle for liberation and success can be characterized both national and local. So you really will have to look at what was the local movement in Detroit with Paul Robeson in the 1930s. What was the local movement in New York compared to Alabama? So it has a lot to do with where those young people are located, the dynamics that are around them, how they can draw from some local examples of success to push forward.
Right. Thank you. Lateefah? And Lateefah, as you address this question, let me also add, is this total responsibility on Black people alone, or is it going to reach out to different groups of people, or how do you see it going forward?
Well, one of my roles is I'm on the board of trustees of the largest public university system in the world. That's the California State University. And what we know is if people would commit who are in education to teaching the truth, that, it answers the truth of this country and the truth of the globe, that our history is central. One of the things that I think is extremely important is to teach the narratives of culture bearers. We talked about many of them, but I'm teaching my daughter Maya Angelou. I'm also teaching her as a straight cis woman. I'm teaching my daughter the radical stories of transgender women in this country and how they've been in movement. Our stories are collective, they are brilliant, and they are bright. I'm teaching my children about revolutionary and radical movements here in this country and abroad with folks who led them with Black and brown skin. I think that a consistent commitment to the truth. That's how we get these stories out there. And it's not just up to Black folks to teach Black history and Black current. The truth is that we're in the center of the story of the world.
Thank you. And Rashad, you get the last word.
Well, first of all, I just want to say it's such an honor and a pleasure to be here. And, the idea of us both paying attention to and being engaged in our history as both sort of a recognition of everything that we can learn, but also all of the ways that we can sort of power our future is so clear. I don't necessarily know what about this movement exactly translates or this moment translates to others. What I do know is that at every single turn, I know my colleagues, and I know that so much of what we do at Color of Change sits on the shoulders and is rooted in the legacy of those that sacrificed so much, built so much, and created so much so we could simply exist and be here and fight for a better future.
Thank you so much. Let me just say that I know we could continue for the next couple of hours because there's such a rich history in the minds of everybody on this panel and everybody in our audience. It's been really great. It's also been a call to action about what is needed to preserve this critically important history. A lot of work, as you've all said, lies ahead, but much of it is to be gained by developing a plan to ensure that history is not lost, but instead preserved. And each of you has indicated ways in which that can happen. I want to thank you all. We want to also thank the HistoryMakers organization for its work. I want to go back to my day in the civil rights movement, where we learned that you always march forward, and you have to keep on keeping on. And in order to do that, let me say, may the wind be always at your back. Thank you all. It's been a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. And I'm so glad to have met each one of you and hope our paths will cross again.
Thank you. What an honor.
Thank you. An honor.